know. See?
Okay, now it was saying that it stopped. Now
I'm start recording now, so you can watch many of the last 2 year sessions on our YouTube page, and so feel free to go and enjoy them. And also this session will be there in the next few days. So if you can just show the next seminar, Tiago going up, please. So the next seminar will be in June. And it will be on hybrid, so both online and face-to-face, and it will be on the housing activism during the pandemic. And we have a last session in July that will be diffused very soon. But now I just want to stop now. I stop here and I let the floor to Lara that will introduce our guests, our today guests, Tanya and Olga. And first of all, I really would like to thank you for being here today. And it's a very special moment for us to have you here. Thank you very much.
So, hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. Thank you, Guya, for inviting me to present this introduction too. And of course, Tanya and Olga for being here with us today to discuss this paper. It's Translating Protests, Network Diasporas and Transnational Mobilization in Ukraine's Euromaidan Protests. That was published earlier this year in the journal Participación en Conflito. And as I understand, also to discuss the critical events concerning the war going on in Ukraine right now. I understand you also wanted to extend it to embrace some of these topics and these events. And I'll first briefly introduce the authors, Tetyana Lokot and Olga Boichak, before moving on to a few words, and I have myself too about the paper. So Dr. Tetyana Lokot, Associate Professor in Digital Media and Society at the School of Communication at the Dublin City University. She researches threats to digital rights, network authoritarianism, internet freedom, and internet governance in Eastern Europe. She's the author of Beyond the Protest Square, Digital Media and Augmented Dissent. That was an in-depth study of protests and digital media in Ukraine and Russia that was launched last year. She's also currently principal investigator on the Mediatized EU project at her, and her research has been published in journals such as Information Communication Society, Social Media and Society, Digital Journalism, Surveillance and Society, Misinformation Review, and Irish Studies International Affairs. She's on the board of directors for the Theorizing the Web conference, and among other things, she chairs the ECREA Media Cities and Space section and is on the editorial board of the Minneapolis Journal. Dr. Olga Boichak is a lecturer in digital cultures at the Department of Media and Communication, Faculty of Arts and Social Science at the University of Sidney. She's a sociologist with expertise in computational social science, and her research interest goes through networks, narratives, and cultures of activism in the digital age. She's the chief investigator on Emerging Online Safety Issues project that explores patterns of social media use among young people, as well as the organizer of the Summer Institutes in Computational Social Science in Sydney. Boichak is an editor of the Digital War Journal, and her work has appeared, among others, in Big Data and Society, International Journal of Communication, Media, War and Conflict, Global Networks, and the Oxford Handbook of Sociology and Digital Media. Well, moving on to a few aspects about the paper. When Guya recommended me to read it, it was like about 2 months ago. First, I thought it would be important to me, mainly because of the methodology applied in the study, as I'm planning to use a similar one in my own research. But then I realized, already in the context of the ongoing Russian invasion, that it was also very important to me in terms of getting to know more about Ukraine's history and social and political context, which I admit I was not very familiar to at that moment. So even though the article was published before Russia's last invasion and therefore do not discuss it directly, of course, what I want to say here is that I think it has strengthened its role as this kind of boundary object that the authors describe in their work. There is an object that is part of multiple social worlds and that facilitates communication between them, which is a process that Tanya and Olga themselves mentioned in their paper, and that I think I could actually experience in practice by reading it at this current moment. So very briefly, focus on the paper specifically, I'd like to highlight a few aspects that caught my attention and that I hope can somehow help articulate what we discussed today. There is this very interesting intersection between theory and methodology that is present in this work. So in a very summarized way, the paper is an in-depth study that combines computational ethnographic approach to analyze how Ukrainian diaspora in the United States engaged with the Euromaidan protests in 2014. And in a broader sense, I think the paper contributes to social movement studies about transnational activism, especially about mobilizations of diasporic communities from the global south leaving the global north. Studies that, as the authors put, are commonly framed through the layers academic literature only. So in this sense, I found some aspects of the paper very important to also think about the events that are going on in Ukraine right now, and in general about events that jeopardize countries and people's sovereignty. Namely the decolonial theory mobilized by the authors, the idea of social media as a contemporary boundary object, and then we can think about other online tools as like the one that we are using now to have this meeting. And finally, the role of affection and the process of translation and identity maintenance carried out by Ukrainian diaspora in the United States. Almost finishing, I mean, in this regard, I think I find it really interesting how computational network analysis and in-depth interviews dialogued and complemented each other in this work, bringing together, on the one hand, the methodology that links on the vocabulary network, building online social groups, as groups that make it possible to bring together different people that have affective and political concerns in common. And on the other hand, a methodology whose main aspect to be taken into account, I think, is the actual listening of the subject and following her or his network through discourse. So here suggests that this combination of following Ukrainian diaspora vocabulary on the web while analyzing, the authors put, the grammars of this diaspora, they're saying about the protests that were going on in their homelands, was a very valuable way to articulate the topics that I just pointed. I mean, this is the colonial perspective, the role of digital media as a boundary object, the prominence of the act of translating, the circulation of affection, and this identity maintenance in this transnational mobilization and activism process. So I'll stay by here so I can leave like Tanya and Olga to, they for sure will have much more to say about these issues. And thank you very much, Tanya and Olga. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Lara. This was very, very good. And I think it was a perfect introduction. And kudos to you for doing such a stellar job and summarizing some of the key aspects of the paper in such a short time. So I'm now going to share my slides and hopefully we can actually see them. So that's all good. Yeah, so we are very excited, and I'm sure Olga will attest to the same. We're very excited to be finally talking about the paper because for one, we really enjoyed working on it, and it was very much a process as a kind of conversation or dialogue for both of us as well. And at the same time, by the time the paper came out and when it was published, the current Russia's current full-scale invasion of Ukraine had already started or was about to start. And so it also meant for us that, you know, we didn't really have time to appreciate, you know, that the paper came out, that the ideas in it were directly connected to what was going on, and that, you know, so we really had no time. So for us, this is really the first time when we get to discuss this paper in a more or less public forum with an attentive audience. So, you know, that moment is not lost on us, and we are incredibly grateful for having the space to do this. So as Lara said, you know, for us, it was really interesting to talk about the events of the Euromaidan protest, also known as the Revolution of Dignity in 2013 and 14, and to specifically talk about these events through the prism of transnational mobilization, and to focus specifically on the role of diasporas. Ukraine has multiple diasporas scattered around the world. Obviously, the US has one of the largest diasporic communities of Ukrainians. And we also thought it was really useful to focus on diaspora, because very often in research on protest movements, diasporas kind of get lost, you know, when we look at the actual protest, because even for Euromaidan, you know, if you mostly focus on the protest in big cities such as Kiev and other Ukrainian cities, you mostly focus on what's happening on the ground. And then what becomes lost is that diversity of networks and the diversity of different publics that actually participate in the protest, among whom diasporic publics were incredibly important and incredibly prominent. And so for us, the opportunity to look at Ukraine as a case of transnational mobilization offers us not only the possibility to examine what different publics participate in the protest and how you know, they contribute to knowledge about the protest, but it's also important for us because Ukraine is also a sort of liminal case, as we say, you know, and it's a case that is liminal because it sits between different sources of knowledge on social movement and digitally mediated protest. On the one hand, we have the sort of dominant Western frameworks that for many of us publishing in English dominate how we understand social movements and digitally mediated protest. On the other hand, it is also a source of knowledge that is distinctly that from the global South or the global East, if we refer to the more specific location of Ukraine. And so it offers us a really different outlook that draws not on the dominant Western histories and conceptual and methodological approaches, but it draws on a very distinct set of histories that are clearly colonial. And these are histories of violence and resistance that are not somehow in the past. These are histories that, as the current events in Ukraine show us, are very real and are still, these histories still have power and there's still impact, they have impact. But, you know, they also produce valuable knowledge that tells us a lot of things we may not take for granted about mobilization in the global South. So I'll hand it over to Olga to talk a little bit about what our goals were with this paper in particular, and then we'll keep going.
Thank you, Tanya, and I also echo my thanks to Lara for such a great read of our paper, and overall for this kind of meta recognition of our paper being that boundary object that actually translates the circumstance, the situation that is happening with the Russian invasion of Ukraine right now to pretty much to Western audiences. So for us, for myself and for Tanya, it was a really interesting experience, kind of identifying ourselves as women from the global South who are in permanent employment in the institutions in the global North. And so producing this knowledge in the global North, kind of using these, trying to really find for ourselves these grammars and vocabularies in which to put forward what's happening, what we saw happening with Euromaidan. And even this is a bit of an eerie experience, really, as Tanya has highlighted, because this paper came out and now we are pretty much again and again experiencing the things that we tried to articulate in our paper. And so it's really relevant. For example, tomorrow I'm going to participate in a protest, and it's going to be a protest to support the people who have been trapped in Azovstal in Mariupol. So there's a worldwide flash mob where people from different cities are taking photographs to raise the kind of the spirits of the people who haven't been evacuated from the Azovstal steelworks. And so in a way, this is really, this paper is really an articulation of mine and Tanya's understanding of what happened. And Euromaidan was such a pivotal moment that even now, all these years after it happened, it has such a significance, a kind of lingering, ongoing significance as the moment when this started. And so thinking through this transition, seeing Euromaidan as an opportunity to translate these knowledge frameworks into a productive dialogue, and also trying to reflect on what it means as being Ukrainian scholars and studying social movements from, as probably one does, a lot of the Western-centric perspectives, and sometimes really missing or lacking words to describe what we're seeing on the ground has really been the impetus of this work. And so this is really our goal, to decenter and perhaps critically address these dominant Western conceptual and methodological approaches that dominate digital protest studies, really finding those grammars and vocabularies and trying to make sense of the epistemic violence, not only the physical violence that had happened and is happening in Ukraine, but also the epistemic violence in which Ukraine is very often framed in the terms that are foreign to us, that really do not represent the essence of the decolonial struggle from within the country. And so this is something that we feel particularly passionate about and why we're here. And so, yeah, really accounting for this continued influence of the colonial histories, including histories of violence, but also very long history of resistance and insurgency that has been going on in Ukraine, but also has been going on among the diasporas. There has been diasporas as this keeper of the institutional memory of Ukraine's national identity. It's really amazing to watch these histories unfold locally, somewhere in parallel, somewhere very distinctly, right? And with the US diaspora specifically, where we know there's 4 waves of diaspora that have been driven by different histories of displacement, and that right now are being increasingly traumatized to see what's happening. Because pretty much this was seeing Ukraine independent and seeing it as an emerging democracy has been the goal of the Ukrainian diasporas for so long. And seeing right now this new wave, new generation of displaced persons arriving in the United States and in other countries, realizing that the history repeats itself is really traumatizing for those among the Ukrainian diasporas who have been through this displacement already. And so, yeah, so that's kind of our goal, to foreground these other heterogeneous drivers of protest and really recognize this incredible diversity of diasporic experiences.
Just checking that my sound is on. I think for us, as Olga suggested, it was really important to bring this attention to the experiences of diasporas, which can often be thought of like, well, people leaving and going in search of a better life in the West, but actually, their experience and their historic kind of background and memory is also very, very much entangled with experiences of violence, both physical and epistemic. And so, of course, we also know that diasporas are incredibly diverse, right? And as Hol suggests, when we talk about diasporas and try to articulate what they are and the meaning that they have for social movements or any sort of mobilization efforts, diasporas are related as much through their differences as through their similarities, right? And even within, say, something that might seem incredibly homogenous, such as the US Ukrainian diaspora, there are actually multiple waves, multiple rationales, multiple generations of people who have very different experiences of both leaving Ukraine and arriving in the US. And they have different motivations for doing so, but nonetheless, despite their differences, in moments of mobilization, we can also see the emergence of this kind of diasporic public that is united and is in solidarity with each other around so specific claims or specific aspects. And this is what we were really interested in seeing, right? Can we say that there are these common vocabularies emerging and common grammars of how they join a mobilization effort, how they participate in such a massive protest movement? Really what we wanted to show is that, there are different sources of knowledge we can use to understand how these geographically dispersed and heterogeneous actors collaborate to produce and represent protest, and how they use these multiple communication channels that now exist, to translate that knowledge, right? And that's why we sort of really grasp onto this notion of translation as a well, sometimes a very literal thing that members of the diaspora do, right? Because as we say in our paper, many of the Ukrainian diaspora representatives actually engaged in just literally translating news about the protest to their communities in their home territories. And I mean, we can say this because we also were part of this effort. We both have experience of literally sitting in front of Twitter and translating news that were coming out in Ukrainian into English. But it's, translation is not just in the literal sense, but also in a more interpretive sense, right? Where we are translating to not just translate what is being said, but to explain why it's important to foreground which things people should be paying attention to, and just literally taking the histories and the kind of ideas that were expressed by the protest movement, and explaining and articulating those ideas in a way that would be understandable and palatable to their immediate environment. And this, of course, is then again influenced by these intersecting social worlds where each of the diasporic publics reside, because again, some of them are based in more traditional communities where there are a lot of shared traditions. Others are operating in a much more modern environment where if somebody migrated for a job, for instance, right, they find themselves in a very different network, and they have to use different language to explain to their colleagues or to their social circles what's going on. But really what we're seeing is that in a way diasporic communities are mobilizing around protest movements are in a way a lot like the scientific community, right? There are a lot of different people, there are a lot of different viewpoints, including political and cultural viewpoints. And so, what emerges is this environment, which is very aptly described by this quote from Starr and Griesemer. It's an environment of representations or inscriptions that contain at every stage traces of multiple viewpoints, multiple translations, and sometimes incomplete battles for meaning. But that's why we thought that this idea of translation was incredibly useful to try and explain the dynamics that occur in Ukrainian diasporic communities. Olga, I don't know if you,
I saw a really great example. It was a video that was trying to convey these experiences of intersecting social context. It was a day in the life of a Ukrainian person abroad, and it just showed a video of someone getting onto the tube, into the subway, and just boarding the train. And so that video was completely there were overlapping images of different wartime events in Ukraine. And that is exactly at times what it feels like, what this embodied experience of being a Ukrainian and keeping your mind constantly tuned into the news stream, while at the same time living a very peaceful life that's kind of separated from the violent conflict. And so really being at this intersection of the social context and trying to articulate those experiences is, I guess, part of what many of us are experiencing these days. And I just thought it was a really nice articulation of that.
And I think, to many people, it might seem like, oh, well, now we understand how Ukrainians living abroad feel while the war is happening. But, the truth is that this is also how a lot of us felt in 2014 when the protest was happening, because especially when the protest became massive and became all-encompassing and diasporic public started to be involved in also very material ways, which we'll talk about in a second, it truly became, part of your life. So for any member of the Ukrainian diaspora, essentially you had your life in your immediate physical vicinity, and then you also had the protest happening in your home country, which spilled out occasionally into local protest rallies, say in the US or elsewhere around the world. But also it was that constant stream of information that you had to sort through, pay attention to, curate, and then somehow retranslate to your local audience, so to speak. And so that is very much kind of the way in which we try to understand the role of social media here, also as these sort of boundary objects or boundary networks which are used by members of the diaspora. So I think, though, that I really would like, because Olga started talking about, these very real histories of colonial experiences and very real histories of colonial violence that is both physical and epistemic. And I think it's a really important thing to focus on so that we understand, where Ukrainians are coming from as diasporas and as people who have been displaced by these recurrent waves of violence and oppression. So, and I think it's really, to us, we felt like, when this most recent invasion started, we felt that our article was actually coming out at a really opportune time, because it turned out that to a lot of people or social media users or even academics in the global north, it turned out that they had very little idea, if any, about these histories, between Ukraine and Russia, but Ukraine in a broader sense as a state and as a national identity that has faced these recurrent waves of colonial oppression, because to many people that just wasn't how they thought about Ukraine, because they, at least to some extent, have come to think of Ukraine as a country in Europe, and so not really in that framework that we typically think of when we think about colonial or imperial histories. So I think it's very important, and I feel it was a very important task for us to devote time in the paper to discussing this intersecting history of post-coloniality and post-communism, and explaining how Ukraine's experiences and Ukrainians' experiences are very much experiences of colonialism, and that even though they might come as a surprise to many external observers, Ukrainians are not surprised. And this language and this rhetoric of post-colonial resistance is one that we've been living with for generations. And so the understanding of the relationships and understanding of the struggles is very much framed for Ukrainians, and especially for many Ukrainian diasporas in these specific terms. So Olga, I don't know if you want to just briefly add a little bit more about this and maybe kind of shed more light on specifically the histories of this for the diaspora.
Yes, absolutely. So it's interesting how decolonial struggles and decoloniality involves this contestation of borders. And in the Ukrainian case, there has been quite some contestation, and we're not only talking about the physical borders on the map, we're also talking a lot about the borders of Ukrainian identity. And we can see this contestation going into the present, and a lot of the less good takes on what is happening in Ukraine involves somehow confusion about, for example, Russian speakers being pro-Russia. And so basically we constantly see those borders being re-articulated, but this is not new, and Ukraine overall has this history and is situated across many empires. And so it used to be this imperial borderland since for the past 500 years. It was placed at the intersection between different empires, and it historically and in the way and geographically that was the case. That even Ukraine's name, Ukraina, means borderland. And so a lot of the times now when we hear this, I guess, hangover of referring to Ukraine as the Ukraine, that is essentially a rhetorical move to highlight this liminal kind of borderland nature of Ukraine and really deny its sovereignty and its nationhood. And so that is why it's really also amazing in a way to see everyone move away from those frameworks. Now more and more colleagues know not to say the Ukraine. Right now there's also been the changing of the grammar rules. A lot of news agencies are adopting the spelling, the Ukrainian language spelling of our main cities, and which is inspiring to see, because really rhetorically this really does go back to whether Ukraine is treated as a kind of a territory that is part of a larger empire, or whether it has its own subjectivity and nationhood by extension. And so this legacy of physical and epistemic violence, it's been lingering. We know that in the 1930s, when there was hunger genocide of Ukrainians by the name of Holodomor, there was a bit of a similar situation where the world kind of knew that this was going on. However, there was a desire to not interfere into the Soviet policies. And so right now, thankfully, we're seeing many Western states take a more active position in witnessing what is happening with the Ukrainians. We also are seeing some unproductive dialogues, whether what is happening now constitutes genocide or doesn't, which we feel completely misses the point, because the situation that is happening right now hits all of the points of being genocide, and this really echoes back to the 1930s. Right now, we're even seeing a lot of children and a lot of the populations of the Russian occupied cities essentially being deported into concentration camps. And these people who are, these populations that are being subjected to this violence are actually the descendants of those who survived the genocide of the 1930s. So it's really, it's sometimes feels very eerie and very surreal to see the history repeating itself on the same territories with the in a range of less than 100 years. And so there have been these local and transnational histories of decolonial struggles, and diaspora really played a very important role in articulating this struggle as decolonial. This poster that you see here, it's actually from the 1960s. And so there has been some amazing scholarship in early 90s trying to frame Ukrainian nationhood as essentially a site of resistance. But unfortunately, that hasn't been very prominent as an idea. And so overall, just this intersectional duality of experiences of intersecting post-communism and post-coloniality in the Ukrainian context is really an exciting way to see those processes that are happening in Ukraine today.
Thank you. Yeah, and so to highlight the role of the diasporas and diasporic networks here, who have always been at the forefront, but also, you know, at the edge of those intersecting experiences, where they are often the publics that are running away from these or being displaced by these colonial expressions of violence and oppression. They're also the ones who are having to translate those experiences to their new homes and, you know, to the new publics that they encounter and that they reside with in their new homes. And so this is also very much what we observed during key moments of mass mobilization. And of course, you know, during the case that we are focusing on in this paper, which is the 2014 Euromaidan protest, which was again, perhaps seemingly to a lesser extent about resisting historical oppression, but nonetheless, it was about negotiating and expressing a sovereign Ukrainian identity, a distinct version of Ukrainian nationhood, and an orientation towards certain values. So not just necessarily an orientation towards Europe for geographical reasons or economic reasons, but an orientation toward a particular set of values, you know, that differed from perhaps the plans that Russia and pro-Russian politicians had for Ukraine and the Ukrainian nation, which Olga has just discussed in a historical perspective. And so we were really interested in trying to examine diaspora's role in the mobilization around Euromaidan protests, and specifically looking at the vocabularies of their mobilization. So what are the structures of Ukrainian Americans' discourses on social media platforms, and how do those structures construct their political participation in the context of the protests in Ukraine? And then also to understand the grammars that they were employing. So what did they perceive to be the affordances of network technologies for that transglobal protest, and how they constructed their own political participation within those networked spaces? So how did they see, use, and negotiate those platforms and technologies that were at their disposal? So we sort of used two complementary data collection methods and sources. So we did a number of interviews with members of the Ukrainian diaspora living in the US throughout 2013 and 2014. And we also collected some data from diaspora groups on Facebook in 3 large American cities, also in 2014. And so we really wanted to capture, as Lara so succinctly pointed out, you know, both the computational methodology for taking these massive amounts of conversations and looking at conversations as data, or, you know, as network data perhaps, but at the same time also being attentive to the experiences of people, right? Because it is really important to also capture, you know, people's experiences on the ground as members of the diaspora, but also people's experiences of participating in a protest through networked spaces and through social media networks. So, you know, nonetheless, yes, the protest was, for many of the members of the diaspora, very much an online affair, but it doesn't mean that it was entirely devoid of physical or material elements, as you will see from our results. And so really it was important for us to capture the big picture and to understand the structures of this discourse, but also to capture the really small stories of experiences, and, you know, how did people live through this, and how did they see their role as translators of the protest to each other and to their audiences in their host countries. So Olga, I'll pass it over to you for some time to talk about the vocabularies and the structures, and we'll have some really pretty slides. So just tell me when to advance to the next slide.
Thank you, Tanya. Yeah, so this first slide, it was interesting to see, this is a social network, and it was interesting to see how different diaspora community groups on Facebook were part of this network. And so it's hard to disentangle some of these, but we can see definitely that Euromaidan was all of the Euromaidan communities and pages are extremely central nodes to this network. So if we see this as an issue network that then has shifted over, because this map was generated in 2016, so this is 2 years after Euromaidan, we still see how Euromaidan was this pivotal moment in then carrying over to this massive wave of grassroots activism, I guess, and volunteering surrounding the war in Ukraine. So what is really interesting here is it's not just, diasporas are not just communicatively constructed actors, right? Like we can talk about the theories of connective action and all the stuff that is traditionally associated with digital activism. We can talk about slacktivism and the kind of older debates, whether digital engagement constitutes any real change on the ground. But here we can see that in these networks, we can see that, for example, in green, there are media organizations that are part of this Euromaidan issue network, but there is a lot of other Euromaidans, like Euromaidan Canada. We can see different Euromaidan France and other so these smaller kind of Euromaidan networks in many different cities and countries around the world that were then contributing to, that carried over to generating different artifacts like military aid, like humanitarian aid for Ukraine. And what's really remarkable here is that it's not only, usually traditionally diasporas had been lobbying their host country governments for this kind of aid. They were signing petitions. We saw a lot of that happen online, but we also saw those more grassroots direct networks of humanitarianism, more kind of horizontal connections between different Euromaidans in different countries, and between the Euromaidans and the kind of the soldiers on the battlefront, where these connections were taking place and where Facebook really was important in facilitating those. And so besides, in addition to these artifacts, right, those material links that were connecting the diasporas with their homeland, we also saw a lot of discursive constructs emerge, and that brings us to the vocabularies of transnational mobilization. So yeah, so we analyzed, what we did is we collected diasporic conversation in 3 Facebook groups. Those were public groups. One of them was based in Seattle, the other one in Boston, and the third one in Chicago. And we collected them over the span of 2014 to really see how and why and in what way they were engaging with their homeland, and also what they were doing. It's a really interesting snapshot, kind of in addition to our interest in their participation in mediated protest. It's really interesting. It just provides an empirical snapshot of what the diasporas are doing overall. And sometimes we would witness efforts to add local integration, which is something that's being amplified right now. So this really illustrates their transglobal nature, is that a lot of the activities that diasporas were engaged in were distinctly local, whereas the other activities were distinctly national and transnational. And so this beautiful kind of entanglements of all those different kinds of activities is really what we could see through the semantic network. So a semantic network overall is a network of co-occurrence. So what we did here is we stripped all the nouns from a unit of speech, and whenever any 2 nouns co-occurred in a post, they would get a link. And so this is here, that's how we can see that. For example, Ukraine was the most central node in the conversation among the Ukrainians in Seattle, we can also see that the HTTP, that they were very exhibiting a lot of linking behaviors to other groups, to other content. So this is interesting in terms of how this mobilization happens cross-platform, right? So just understanding which kind of goes a bit beyond our understanding of connective action as this kind of more flatter theory to explain mobilization within a certain platform. We see a lot of cross-platform connections. We can also see a lot of political discussions. So Tanya, if you would move to the next slide. So here we can see distinctly political discussion. This is Boston. We could see a lot of discussions that are connected to Russia. And so there is already, back in 2014, these attempts to articulate the borders of national identity, the borders of territory, and to discuss them. And so then, if next slide.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, you know, when we think about political, obviously we're not just talking about geopolitical, right? Which is, we have Russia here, we have American, we have Putin, but also political in the sense of like, you know, the personal is political, because we also see very prominently things like action, community, citizen, freedom. So it's really interesting, again, that even the political connections and expression are happening on multiple levels here. So I just wanted to add that in. Yeah, moving to the next slide.
Yeah, absolutely. And also what we could see here, so we see linking to other groups, community groups, which we saw on the social network before. We knew that to be the case, but also here in purple, we can see efforts at direct to raise humanitarian and military aid directly. So BART, Family, Boy, Hero, Help, Live. People were requesting help, were using these spaces to request help directly, to report on the money that was sent. And so there are a lot of these smaller kind of narratives about just Ukrainians helping each other through. And so in this context, it was really interesting to see the role of Facebook as mediating the social trust. And this is one thing that's distinct about socially mediated protest and socially mediated activism, is that on social media, it is really possible to perhaps verify different individuals, to vouch for their integrity, to report. So a lot of these actions that were happening among diasporas, they were much more transparent than, say, just in the case of the previous instances of activism. And so that is what we see. There's really efforts to directly engage with different communities in crisis by diasporas. And yeah, I think that is, and the discussions in the context of discussions of war, as we see here in Chicago with that were highlighted in orange.
Yeah, and it's obviously really difficult sometimes from these maps in particular to disentangle protests from war, because obviously in terms of the temporality, right, the Euromaidan protests ended in February 2014, and then almost immediately after, the Russian invasion and occupation of Crimea and eastern parts of Ukraine began. So in many ways, these same groups and these same networks, both in Ukraine and outside, you know, the transnational networks, they all pivoted from supporting protesters to supporting volunteers and the military, and aiding and, you know, displaced people in their plight. So it's also really interesting to see the continuity of these networks, which we'll come back to shortly. And I just want to add, you know, from the point of view of taking these vocabularies and seeing these structures and understanding how protesters themselves sort of internalized them as grammars, as, you know, what they saw was their repertoire of action. It's interesting that in our interviews, we saw a lot of confirmation. So people's experiences very much mirrored what we saw in the structures in the social media conversations, you know, where they also talked about being involved in the protest in a networked sense. So, you know, being involved in the protest action back home, by experiencing it through social media, but also creating opportunities and coming together in a very physical and material sense in their host countries to replicate or to translate the messages and the claims that were being created by the protest community, and making them kind of local and making them visible and understandable to local communities, right? The other thing that really came through strongly in terms of their grammars of protest activity among diaspora members was this idea of these networks and these conversations enabling effective self-identification. So people really felt like participating in the protest and being part of the protest and serving as this boundary person object translating the messages of the protest also enabled them to self-identify as Ukrainian. And for some of them, especially the newer waves of diaspora, much more strongly than before, and also to identify as protest participants, even though they weren't necessarily present at the epicenter of the protest in Ukraine. So social media afforded them this opportunity. And here's a quote from one of the interviews, who discusses experiencing the protests through some of the live streams and live tweets and news feeds, and saying the closest you could get to being there and living through it without actually being there. I don't know if I can compare it to anything when you're sitting on the edge of your chair watching the crowds in downtown Kiev engaging in a battle, and you almost feel like you are there. And so that really creates a very different perception than, say, just reading the news feeds, right? So in a way, yes, there was definitely geographical distance, but in terms of identifying with the protest and with its goals, and even effectively experiencing the protest, social media certainly played a very important role for many of our diaspora interviewees. And obviously, these connections weren't just effective or just discursive, they were everything, right? There was a mix of material connections by providing aid, fundraising, going out to protest. So this is a photo from a protest in Washington, D.C., for instance, which kind of happened already when the protest was almost over and the Russia's military incursions began in 2014. So it starts to marry the messages from the protest with anti-war messages, even at that very early point, right? And also the sense that, diaspora members really experienced these protests also as a communal affair, right? And having these network spaces where information was being exchanged and where they could take information and then relay it to their environment. It also made them feel like they were part of something bigger, right? So again, it made them feel like they were part of the history of Ukraine unfolding. So as this particular interviewee suggests, knowing that there were thousands of other people watching these live streams, seeing photos, scrolling through tweets, and also going out and protesting wherever they happened to be, was somehow reassuring. Like all of us were, on the one hand, watching history being made, but also feeling like we were part of this history, right? So I think the marriage of these different kinds of connections was very important because it allowed people to really feel like they were serving as vehicles of articulation or vehicles of translation in a way. And here again is an example of a community on Facebook that was created to fundraise specifically for equipment to support hospitals in Ukraine, which first served those protesters who were injured, and then very quickly began to pivot to serving people injured in military activity, or both civilians and members of the military, when the incursion into Crimea and Eastern Ukraine began in 2014. And so, again, here we're seeing diaspora playing a multi-pronged role, where they're actively participating in a way, in a communicative way, because they're serving as vehicles of translation of the protest messages, but they're also translating the very real material needs, and then also in a very real way contributing to filling those needs, because they're fundraising money. And sometimes, it's not just fundraising money on Facebook, but it's literally members of the diaspora packing suitcases full of medical supplies and literally carrying them to Ukraine. And so again, a very real marriage of material, discursive, and effective connections in this regard. And then finally, I want to really just quickly illustrate, to say that, this war indeed started in 2014. And this war that we are all talking about now did not start in February 2022. And so for many Ukrainians, including many members of the Ukrainian diaspora, the reality of war has existed for the past 8 years, right? And obviously, the war affected different Ukrainians differently. The people living in Crimea and Eastern Ukraine were perhaps the most affected. Many of them became displaced or lost their lives. Many other people living in Ukraine have felt the impact of the war differently. But even among diasporas, right, the war has been a constant presence, and the recent full-scale invasion kind of really became the next step, right? And so in a way, the fact that people continue to understand their role as translating or articulating Ukrainian identity and the sort of key messages around Ukraine's position in this war, and the dynamics of Ukraine's relationship with Russia is not surprising, because for them all of these events connect together, and there are distinct similarities with what we're seeing in, however, obviously we're not systematically looking at diaspora's role now, but we're seeing a lot of similarities with what we saw in 2014 and 2015. So literally, again, we're seeing English-speaking Ukrainians and diasporas elsewhere engaging in translating what the war means and how we should talk about the war in a post-colonial context, right? So this image here is a very popular image that was circulated by many Ukrainian accounts, including Ukrainian English-speaking accounts, which basically suggests that there are certain ways in which you should talk about the war if you want to pay credit to what is actually going on, right? So they're saying, don't call it events in Ukraine, call it the Russia-Ukraine war, or call it Russia's war in Ukraine. Don't say you wish for peace, say, I wish Russia stopped invading Ukraine. So it's really interesting how, they're really intervening in the conversations and saying, this is how you should talk about it if you want to acknowledge the colonial and post-colonial histories, right? So a lot of what people are doing now is they're explaining, they're correcting, they're contextualizing. So they're saying, here are these vocabularies and grammars that already exist. We suggest you use them. Olga, I don't know if you want to add anything else or if you want me to go to the conclusion.
Let's probably go to the conclusion in the interest of time. Yeah, so that is it. The role of diasporas in really translating the Euromaidan, and as Tanya said, using those grammars and vocabularies to rhetorically explain the significance of Maidan and to kind of try to perpetuate some more narratives that really represent the events that are happening in Ukraine. And so Euromaidan really was this major point of passage in Ukraine's nation building project. We can see it in the social networks. We can see it through the qualitative work that really this amazing resistance that somehow has inspired the world over the past 2.5 months. There have been roots of this resistance. There have been roots of those networks already being planted in 2013 and 14. And so this translation and this convergence between those incongruous notions of national identity is really a process that we witnessed in Euromaidan and that we are still witnessing now, where to be honest, it's really inspiring to see, for example, a lot of the times writing about the Russian-Ukrainian war in 2014, in 2015, we often got corrected, for example, the concept of the Russian-backed separatists, right, that keeps haunting. It's actually like a specter of the Russian doctrine of reflexive control that still haunts the imaginaries of what was happening, even though everyone knows by now that this was a Russian orchestrated insurgency. So even so, those small rhetorical changes are hugely significant. And right now we're of course seeing the mainstream media adopt these more proper articulations of the events in Ukraine that started in 2014. And so this convergence between those incongruous notions of not only of national identity, but also of the representation of the events that had taken place in the past or are taking place now is really what's happening in this process of translation. These material, discursive, and affective connections, as Tanya has pointed out, they're those entanglements, this radical sense of co-presence with the other diasporas, with the people in the homeland, I guess this whole notion of the conflict-generated diasporas, and we're seeing the diasporas come together one more time, regardless of the waves, regardless of their histories of migration surrounding the war. And really this pivotal moment of possibility when these civic vocabularies of Ukrainians living within as well as outside the country's borders were merged, probably for the first time in Ukraine's history, which is, I guess, which has profound implications on the Ukraine's state building project. And so translating these local meanings and these cultural codes that were associated with Euromaidan, diasporas really strove to reach those global audiences through their use of grammars and vocabularies. And this is a process that we hope will continue. We hope we will continue to see this convergence of experiences on the ground with their representations in the Western media, in the Western academia. Yeah, this is our outlook going into the future, I guess.
Yeah, and of course, given the fact that we are now seeing a very swift emergence of new diasporas, given the massive displacement that has happened because of Russia's war, it's obviously interesting to see, you know, how this process will continue. But it's also very clear that I think the new diasporas, you know, the new people who are coming across the border are much better prepared for this translation work because they've already been doing it to an extent, or at least have been exposed to it during the past 8 years. And so in a way, the newer diaspora waves understand that that is part of who they are, and it's part of their work, and it's part of their identity to continue to do this work of translation and to do this work of articulation, because it is now an existential matter. It's not just a matter of we want to tell the world about the protest, but it's a matter like we want to tell the world about this because our country is at stake and our national identity is at stake. So, you know, this has even more urgency. And so, again, as Olga said, we are quite hopeful about the development of these processes. So that's all on our side. We'd be happy to answer any questions or take any comments. And again, thank you so much for giving us a platform to talk about this. Thank you very much to you. It was super interesting. Well, I knew the paper, but of course the connection with the present, that's also the reason why I really wanted you be here. So I know that Tanya, you need to leave in 15 minutes, so maybe I leave the floor to Tiago. Will collect the questions, and when you feel, and Olga, maybe you can stay more, or you also need to leave.
Okay, thank you for such an interesting paper. I didn't have the chance to read it in advance, but I skimmed through it, and you know, it really clarified a lot of stuff, and it was really interesting. So I think we can move on to the discussion and the debate. And who is up for a question, a comment?
Well, I would have many, but I also don't want to monopolize the. So before.
Yeah, I have a few as well, but
I have, I have two, but also
maybe people. Maybe
I
Luca.
think Luca.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I have. It's like it's more like a curiosity than one question, but I really wanna. I mean, now I want to ask to you if there are some difference between the clan and the master narratives in each city that you study, and also by this data that you collected, if it's possible to know how this group communicates with other pro-Ukrainian initiatives or pro-Ukrainian protests or pro-Ukrainian actions in other parts of the world or even in other parts of the West.
Tanya, would you?
Yeah, I mean, I would be inclined to give you maybe the floor first, because I know you were more involved in collecting the network data, but then I might add something.
Can I suggest that we collect a few more if they're so? Yeah. Okay. Is there any other question? Okay, Luana.
Thank you both for the presentation, and I think it's a very interesting study. and got me thinking a lot, so I will definitely read the paper. And I was just here thinking if you will continue this study today in the context of war, because I was here thinking that with the involvement of USA, and I imagine that these groups are very active right now, so I was here hoping that you would continue this. And actually one more thing, thinking about this intersectional duality of experience, I was thinking here how that appears as Ukrainians in America, in this ambivalence of identity, and also as migrants in America that is very discussing of all these things. So I was thinking about that. Thank you both very much.
Well, I don't know if there's any other question, but if not, Tanya and Olga, please go ahead. Lara?
Yeah, I have actually two questions, but I'll ask the first one that is more technical, so it's also quicker. That's about the cluster that you mentioned in the article. That I think was separated by colors, and if I understood well, were like main three clusters that were effective civic vocabularies, local, national, and international discussions on politics. And the other ones that were linked to platform mediated collectives, or that were appealing to petition signatures and this kind of material activism. And it's really technical, like, did you had to apply like some kind of thematic content analysis to it? Or is also something that you can do through computational programming? Or it's a self-interest question because I'm also willing to do it in my research.
Okay, so Tanya, would you like me?
Yeah, I think you can kick off maybe and talk about maybe the first question about the differences in the city groups, and then if you also want to address Lara's question, but then I'll fill things in.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first Lucas question, how the groups were different. I guess to us, structurally, when we look at the structure of discourses in these groups, they looked very similar. And that is something that was really exciting to find because, of course, the conversations among the groups were different. Of course, there were different people discussing these things. But when we look at the structure, really, that is something that can show us whether, whether there, of course, sometimes the terms that were used in the groups were slightly different, but structurally they were very similar. And we found, which connects to Lara's question, we found similar clusters and similar communities across those three groups. So that actually was an exciting discovery, showing us that really the diasporas are different, right? And it's, of course, they're local, they're very specific to a locale, but then structurally there really is a footprint, or if you will, I don't know, a signature or a model that really shows what kinds of actors they are. And so Lara, going back to your question, I used community detection algorithms, and it depends, this clustering really depends on what kinds of, there is at least 3 community detection algorithms that one can use. And depending on the algorithms, there might be a different number of clusters. And so some of the algorithms are more, are kind of more, allow for more kind of fragmented communities to occur. Overall, the modularity in those communities still remains low. So to be honest, a lot of this analysis that is being done after those communities are detected is qualitative. This is something that we're transparent about because this is something that sometimes it is a barrier to further analysis of these networks because those topics are so intertwined between each other. So a lot of the times we qualitatively have to validate it, right? See the terms and then go back to the original messages and really see whether they convey what we think they convey. And then the labeling of those topics is qualitative. So it's done by us as it's an act of interpretation. But yeah, what I would suggest to do is to run some of these algorithms and seeing what works on your data, even though, to be honest, this is such a empirically fraught approach that I'm actually part of. I have a grant application in developing more sophisticated community detection algorithms. So this is something that I'm actually working right now within computational social science. I would like to turn it over to Tanya because I know you have to leave. So let's yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think actually, you know, just to sort of follow through on what you were saying, I think it's actually perfectly fine, you know, given the sort of theoretical framework with which we're approaching this task, to have that qualitative element that, you know, very often relies on local knowledge. Because I mean, you know, as you said, we are ourselves kind of also these boundary objects, you know, or boundary subjects. So we're involved in this work of translation, right? And so like, yeah, well, an algorithm is never perfect. It can never tell you everything about the kind of community that it's chunked out for you. It can show you, yeah, here are some communities that we've spotted. And then you really have to go in and say, okay, you know, what can we know? What can we infer about this community? And then use our own local knowledge or knowledge that we've also gained from interviews, right? Because like, I can give you an example, for instance, you know, in one of the maps that you were showing, there was this one community that formed around Razom for Ukraine, which is a nonprofit organization that started during Euromaidan in the US, I think in New York. Razom for Ukraine, obviously, you know, it's an organization, but it started as a group of people coming together and saying, what can we do? How can we structure this fundraising effort better? And, you know, because I know about this group and because one of the people I interviewed happened to also be one of the activists involved in starting this group, to me, right, I can sort of say, okay, well, I know what they're about, so I know what kind of a community they're part of, or they're what kind of community is centered around them. And then, you know, once we know who these groups are, and this brings me to Luana's question, you know, is like, we can continue doing this work because guess what? A lot of these communities and organizations continue to be active. They've continued to be active in the past 8 years. And they're now raising funds for internally and externally displaced people in the war. They're raising funds to support hospitals, treating the wounded. And, you know, these are the same groups. They're not necessarily all the same people because obviously in the past 8 years, there's a new generation of activists that have grown up. And, you know, now people in their 20s and early 30s who weren't there before because they were going to school, they're now also joining these efforts. But very often we can identify continuity, right? And obviously for us, that's important because it means that when we look at what's going on around the war today, we can say there is a history of this mobilization. There is a history of these groups who have kept up these connections and, you know, these connections that are effective and discursive, but also logistical and material. So it's really interesting to look at these multiple levels of how do Ukrainians manage to fundraise for drones and flak jackets so quickly? Well, it's because these structures are already in place and because these structures are not just structures of logistics and how do we transfer money, but they're also structures of trust, right? And so when people already trust each other, it's much easier to get people to give you money or to give you support or to give you, I don't know, some kind of media coverage or whatnot. But like, that's important. And without that, we can't explain what's happening in Ukraine today regarding mobilization around the war effort if you don't know that history that we've just described in our paper.
Yeah, and it's perhaps a radical assertion on our part, but really the scope of the activities to support of the humanitarian, of the military activities by these grassroots organizations has been in place since 2014. The scale has changed undoubtedly by many orders of magnitude, and this is what the world is finally seeing, and this is what really amazes so many people. It's like, wow, Ukrainians are so resilient. How are they doing these things? How are they getting into the hotspots, the conflict zones where even the Red Cross and many humanitarian organizations are really unable to get into? Well, that is why these networks have been in place all of those years, and that's why they're so agile. They work with incredibly fast pace. They're very flexible in what needs to be done and what has to be done, kind of matching. And again, translating those needs on the ground back to the benefactors, getting resources. And so, yeah, this was an amazing transformation throughout those 8 years that has led to where we are today.
Yeah, and on this, I'll just say that I do really have to jump off, but if Olga is happy to stay and chat, then I'm super delighted. And thank you all again for giving us this opportunity to discuss our research with you.
Thank you to you, Tanya, and thank you very much for joining. Keep in touch.
Thank you very much, Tanya.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Okay, I'm happy to answer more questions or to chat.
Yeah, I would really like, if I may, Tiago, if I allow me.
Of course.
We don't want to take all your time, but well, I would have many questions also, because I was reading something that you also wrote, also even before this started the beginning of the war. You wrote this very short text on the website of your university, why Ukrainians are ready to fight for their democracy, and I was really impressed because of the lucidity of your analysis, and also about this thing that you are working on the reflective control. And so just to I saw that you have also a podcast, so maybe we can on this, right? So maybe we can I think that Andre is sharing messages with everybody. Andre, be careful. But maybe we can share after. If you can send us the link, I can share with the colleagues here that for sure they will be super interested about this. But just to quick move to my questions. So this point about, I will have many, but just to try to be quick, I think it's what you also did in your article to use the tools of post-colonial studies to study the case of Eastern Europe, and specifically Ukraine, is something that it should be obvious in a certain way, should be kind of accepted and legitimate, but is very not used. So as you mentioned it also here, and what is my impression is that there isn't the global East, as you also mentioned this expression in your paper, doesn't have the same legitimacy to use these tools both in academic and in public opinion in the West. So in respect to the global South. So what's the reason of this, in your opinion? Because it's really this kind of, as you say, that the violence of this epistemology and the not recognition that this is a colonial war is very strong, and it very surprises me. It's very surprising me. And what's the reason of this is the fact that the people and groups that are using these tools for understanding the conflicts on the global South have some also connection with the former Soviet Union, well, which is also for many leftists on the West, including myself, and my tradition is I come from a leftist background. So there was this kind of connection implicit because of many reasons that, of course, even if it was very problematic, and we all recognize this, but this prevent to accept the legitimacy of this discourse when it's developed in Eastern Europe countries. So I'd like to know what your opinion about this. And also, I really liked, and I think it's I don't know how you can deal with this epistemological fight each day, because I think it's really demanding. So I would like to know about your experience and how this impact also your work and your. I coming from Italy, there was this, I arrived much later in respect to this debate, but the strong attempt to call the resistance war against Nazi fascism in Italy as a civil war. And this is very important, because the words have meaning and create realities. And so just I want to stop here, but I would have many more things, but I stop here.
Thanks, Guya. Thank you for your kind words, and thank you for your leadership in organizing this issue, because Tanya and I were very motivated when we saw the call for papers to contribute, because this is something we've both been feeling particularly strongly. This is something that where there hasn't been that much written about it, and so we felt like we finally could find the words to articulate what it means and kind of contextualize Ukraine as a global South. It's a very strange. Ukraine overall I guess is a one-off case. It's a South in the North, but then we also know that there is a lot of North in the South. So, for example, myself writing from Australia, which is a North in a part of the global North that's geographically located in the global South. So kind of trying to understand those disconnects between the geographical mapping, right, and grouping.
Ireland for many years also. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so these, I guess, experiences of being writing as an academic from the global South in the global North have encouraged myself and Tanya to really reflect on what it means for us and what it means for knowledge creation. There is some scholarship that talks about Ukraine in the context of global East, but then there's a danger of grouping it together with the other post-communist, post-socialist countries, not always it's an accurate comparison. Some struggles are really similar in those places, and the others, kind of like Ukraine, that has a very distinct history, is really kind of a one-off. But to be honest, I've been struggling with it a lot. And even I remember when I was finishing my PhD and I was applying for jobs, and there was a job in the geography of the global South. And I thought, wow, I'm so perfectly positioned for this, because this is actually what I'm studying. And then my dissertation supervisor said, oh, honey, this is completely, you have nothing to do with it, because really this is not Ukraine. We rarely place Ukraine on the map of the global South. And this is actually true. So this is the epistemic violence, right? When you can relate to the decolonial struggles of many places in the global South, and whereas at the same time they're not acknowledged, but they are more acknowledged with every day. And so this is one thing. With regard to your second question, so framing the Ukraine's decolonial struggle as a civil war, that is the direct implication of Russia's reflexive control, right? Which the purpose of which is to model the information environments in which adversaries are trying to make decisions. So this is the direct. There have been over the past 3 decades of Ukraine's independence, Russia has engaged in this tactic, in this strategy. What's most significant is that observing the significant military buildup in December, in January of 2022 through February. So the information was there, and we could see that Russia had the capabilities for this full-scale invasion, and yet somehow there was no alarm raised. A lot of the scholars were talking about the Cold War and how this is kind of like the Cuban Missile Crisis, and all these very wrong, inaccurate historical comparison to what actually happened. And it was pretty much only the Ukrainians who were ringing the alarm and saying, look, this has been happening. We know what Russia is capable, and we know that this can happen. And so even this framing of the civil war, that is something that Russia has very actively engaged in constructing. And this is, again, where this epistemic violence is really not just metaphorical, where it actually translates into very real violence on the ground. And so this is, I guess, one thing that we can talk about: hybrid warfare. It's sort of informational, but there's actual people's lives at stake. And it's always those lives that we have to consider when thinking about how information environments affect it. So that's what the podcast is about. It's about visualizing war and recontextualizing and thinking also of the multiple experiences of war, some of which are less mainstream, right? So when we're seeing the war in Ukraine, there's a lot of those very traditional representations of the tanks and the maps, the troop movement maps, all the military equipment. So that's very much part of how we see the war, but also we can see the war through the eyes of some of the people who are displaced, through the eyes of the people who have suffered. And so that is part, I guess, of this information environment. And this is something that those diasporas are really actively engaged in translating and explaining the significance of. Oh, Maria, it's coming out tomorrow, so I can only say that it's called Visualizing War, and it's a podcast. It's available on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts. So I think it drops tomorrow. There's now just a few teasers of it, but it's a conversation about. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Guya, have I answered yours, or do you have any? You're muted.
I will have more, but I think I keep no, just maybe some short thing that what I was following some seminars also by Ukrainian sociologists that are in Ukraine, some webinars, and I was really impressed about the depth of the democratization process ongoing, also in terms of decentralization, like different local process of participatory democracy also. And this this me was really impressive because we don't know anything of this. So also what Tanya was mentioning before, that there is all this situation is read mostly through the lenses of macro politics and geopolitics, while there is a politics ongoing and political dynamics and democratic practices ongoing that explain more this situation, particularly in terms of the resistance that we can see. I think that we can see through this resistance of people in Ukraine that there is a civil society, a strong civil society that is you don't have is a sign of deep democratization process ongoing. I think so. Yeah, just this. I wanted to mention. What do you think about this thing?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. In fact, we're about to publish another work with my colleague Brian McKernan, which is where we look exactly at these things. We look at, so if you look at Ukraine from the standpoint of very traditional metrics of civil society development, you would have, how many NGOs there are, how many people are members of different NGOs, what's the budget of NGOs. So it's very this Western-centric perspective at the civil society. And at the same time, we're seeing these grassroots networks, and where we've interviewed people and looked at how they narrate their wartime activism. And we saw that through their narratives, but also through their actions on the ground, they're actually reconstituting, they're coming up with critical civic vocabularies, and they're leading to a facilitation of new emerging norms and values that basically are those, as you said, those beginning, we're seeing this democratization, we're seeing this civil society development that is exceptionally strong, but that is not visible if you don't know what to look for. And this is again where your positionality to this to this country, I guess, to the site of research really matters, because it's very easy to overlook those stories. And even seeing people who are doing very mundane, immediate things, such as, well, I didn't do anything. I just bought a lot of drinking water and I drove it over to the battlefront because the soldiers were starving or didn't have access to drinking water. It seemed very mundane, there's some spectacular things that are happening, but there's also those mundane acts that contribute to Ukraine's resistance, where people completely don't make a big deal out of it, but they actually are articulating these new models of engaged citizenship, where there is a shift between the duty-based citizenship, in which you're required to do something as a citizen, to more engaged practices of the small p politics, and realizing that even acts of care can be political and geopolitical in this sense. And so this is something that I'm really excited about. This is something that I'm really optimistic about. And this, I do hope, because this is such a strong foundations of civil society that is informal, and that is why we don't recognize it.
And also the support for the measures. No, I could see this really city-based and local-based resistance that is very interesting. But I stop here. I will talk about more, but I want to leave for more time.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Lara and Andrea, Ruben, Maria, Luana, and Luca?
I had something, but you also want to ask, no, Tiago? It's
well, but I'm sharing, so I'll leave myself.
Okay.
And I have a very simple question. So
also, it's not actually, I think, a question, but like kind of a concern also about involving like network analysis and social media analysis that I have in my research as well. That is like thinking about like social media as two-edged swords, like that we have the affordance that is like, that's actually really interesting how it's explaining the paper like as a boundary object, But then, like on the other hand, we also have like some studies that shows its propension to spread like false information over accurate information, its affinity to populist appeals, and I think other issues that are related to like economic power and political power dominance in the digital media as well. And for example, when you're doing like the issue map, issue network map, you have like an issue and you have all the groups that are all the Facebook group pages, for example, that are talking about an issue. And I think it's more like, it's not, I don't know if it's a question, but like, how can we kind of protect ourselves, like as researchers, from giving space to, I don't know how to say it, but like to some kind of narratives and political interests that are involved in these discussion about a specific issue. Like, for example, in the Euromaidan protests, to protecting from giving space to putting Facebook page, for example. I know, because in the second network analysis, we choose like specific Facebook page and we work on the vocabulary on these. But in the first one, it's like an issue, and then you have all the groups that are talking about this. And thinking about, for example, these constraints of social media, like you have, for example, a lot of disinformation, Facebook page and Twitter or whatever, that can also be talking about some specific issue. How can we like try to counterbalance these in our research, not to give space to this kind of unwanted narratives?
Thanks, Laura. I think that's a very important question. And I think that is one thing that computational methods perhaps might fall short. At least the computational methods that we're using might fall short in disentangling. I have here a paper that I co-authored with a colleague. We actually analyzed, so we chose 5 groups of Ukrainians in Canada. So this is in a bit of a different context, but we also analyzed we tried to map the national web. And by that, we used hyperlinks shared in those Facebook communities as a socio-semiotic trace that is connected different geographic locations, right, and different kinds of content. And we were trying to see what kinds of content were those diasporas linking to, right? Were they linking to other communities? Were they linking to news? And so what we did here, sorry, Ruben, may you ask ST?
Something, I guess.
Later,
exactly.
Yeah. So we did content analysis, and what we actually saw attempts at orchestrated intervention in these communities. So that was like, wow. So there are actually actors that either create diasporic communities that then have people join them under the guise of this very grassroots organic community, and then just systematically feed. And how we knew that, because we mapped the URLs, we parsed the IP addresses from the URL. So we were trying to see the geographic location of the content that the diasporas were posting. And so there was one particular group. And this is, again, going back to Luca's question, this is where structurally you can see, this is what an organic network looks like. This is what diaspora does. And you can do semantic networks, you can do content analysis, and you would see some of the regularities in what those groups do. And so then you know what the pattern is. And then when you see something that's going way beyond or very systematically different from that pattern, that's how you know that there's likely something going on. It doesn't necessarily mean there's orchestrated intervention, but if you see, for example, one community that's very quantitatively or qualitatively descriptively different from the others, then you can try to investigate it and see that something is up. And so that is how we found one group being completely fake, linking to some very shady gray area content, and they were different across all parameters. So they were different. They posted in the Russian language, which was like, disproportionately large number of posts is in the Russian language. And then having relocated to Sydney myself, I also joined a lot of groups for Australians for Ukrainians in Australia. And I saw one group just like that. There's just this parade of Russian propaganda under the guise of information, of news. And it was just interesting for me to stay there just to observe what is happening. but then again, so this is how, but then again, I had to visit actually click on each of the URLs to see what kind of content it linked to, and then manually kind of label it, tag it, and then do some analytics based on that. So this is the paper that I shared. So again, sometimes you have to combine some of the more manual, very labor intensive content analysis, or do some qualitative analysis to really find those things. But then structurally, you will have a different snapshot, and that's, I guess, what will tell you that something is up. That's a very empirically, I don't know, it doesn't sound very rigorous, but it actually works, and it helps find those instances of orchestration if you're looking for them.
Thank you, Olga.
Thank you. Oh, I think Andre just wrote something.
No, but Ruben before.
Ruben before was asking. So Ruben, do you want to ask?
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's very interesting, your presentation and your paper. And I guess this comment by Andre is also connected with my question. What I want to ask you is if you observe any kind of connection between a kind of injustice frame regarding the political regime in Ukraine and the construction of a national identity of Ukrainians in those decades, how these ideas are connected in your digital discourse analysis.
Thank you, Ruben. I guess this is not something that is coming purely out of the digital discourse analysis, but one thing that we can definitely see, this is more of a qualitative, kind of more rich interview finding, is that, and this started during Euromaidan, is the articulation of a civic version of Ukrainian identity. And this is something that that presents a stark contrast to the ways in which the Russian national identity is articulated, right? So this is going away from that very narrow ethno-nationalist framework, which is actually, ironically, this is one notion of a national identity that has been preserved among the Ukrainian diasporas for a long time, was this ethno-nationalist view of being ethnically Ukrainian, speaking Ukrainian language, and therefore identifying as a Ukrainian. With Euromaidan, something really interesting happened, is that a lot of people from all walks of life got together in this public square or a forum and were able to articulate this new identity that is civic, that is based on values, that is based on the norms of democratic citizenship. And that identity then got to stand in. And so this is the identity that a lot of Ukrainians can join in. This is a very much broader umbrella that incorporates ethnic minorities, for example, Crimean Tatars that had historically felt disenfranchised and excluded from those kind of very ethno-nationalist notions of the Ukrainian identity. It also exemplifies the heterogeneity of Ukrainians. Even what's really illustrative of it is the so-called Heavenly 100, those people who were shot by the snipers in the course of the Euromaidan protests. A lot of those who were the very first ones to be killed were people of other ethnicities. It was a person from an Armenian descent. It was a Belarusian person. So overall, we're seeing this diversity of Ukrainians, I guess, through this, through those identities of protesters who identified as Ukrainian, even though ethnically they weren't Ukrainian or they would be Russian speaking. So right now, this is one thing that is really difficult, I guess, to also explain in the Western frameworks. A lot of the times when, for example, I would be interviewed and people would say, well, but there are also people who are speaking Russian, and automatically assume that because there's Russian speaking, they are pro-Russian or they want to be part of Russia or they're ethnically Russian, which is very, so disentangling those things and understanding that the Ukrainian identity is much broader, that it incorporates people who are Russian speaking and people who are even of Russian ethnicity but identify as Ukrainian is really one thing that Euromaidan gave us, I guess, as a product, as the civic identity. And again, but this is not coming from the digital analysis, more of sitting down with people and trying to understand their values and of civicness, if I may say.
Okay, thank you. I don't know. Andre also wrote a question. I don't know if he wants to ask.
Andrea, would you like to ask it, or do you want me to read it?
Yeah, I could possibly ask, but I'm currently lacking the proper usage of my voice. So, but it basically deals with the question of banal nationalism and how these forms of solidarity that you were saying in the last comment. I think that answering to Ruben, you more or less touched upon some of the things that I was asking, but it's mostly that perhaps those mundane forms of solidarity that you were saying, perhaps some of these could be cautiously read or understood as these emerging forms of banal nationalism that may foster civic engagement, but can also be politicized in the future by some political groups. So it can also be dangerous somehow. So that's why I was asking, because when dealing with nationalism, how national identities on the one hand foster civic engagement, of course, and those practices of solidarity, they can also be used for other means. And one of the things that I was asking was perhaps how this new rhetoric of nationalism that is being put forward because of the very situation can be dangerous somehow in the future. So of course it seeds some important perspectives for now, but also for the future it can pose some problems, I would say.
Yeah, I hear your point. And also, again, looking from the Western kind of scholarship, we often see nationalism as a contentious, right, phenomenon. We see the resurgence of nationalism in Europe, which probably you're all, again, seeing in many instances happen in many countries. We can see the outcomes of the most recent elections around Europe in the recent 2 years. We could see some of the resurgence of that nationalism, and we can also see it as something that might even be otherizing to the minorities living in those countries. So I see your point from that lens, but also in the case of Ukraine, I guess nationalism is something, it is not ethno-nationalism, right? This civic identity, is the civic national identity of Ukraine, is being used as the main, I guess, epistemological driver of resistance to Russia. And this is one thing, if anything, yes, it has definitely gotten solidified, and a lot, it did contribute to the kind of emergence of a much tighter knit community that identified with this identity, including those Ukrainians living abroad. Right now, there is this amazing set of unity. Whether it can be dangerous in the future, we can see. I mean, as long as this nationalism is not, this is not articulation of the Ukrainian identity in opposition to something. So I guess it's like the notion of the positive and negative liberty, where one is liberty from and the other one is liberty to. So I can see Ukrainian nationalism as more liberty to. It is not anti, because this is what Russia is trying to instill, is that Ukraine is anti-Russia. So Russians increasingly identify themselves in opposition to Ukrainians. The Ukrainians do not have that goal. It doesn't seem like Ukrainians are identifying themselves as qualitatively different from Russia. They're self-identifying based on their history and a lot of other attributes. So these are more kind of value-driven. I mean, can it backfire in the future? We can see, as long as it's right now, as long as it's inclusive, I don't see any. So yeah, unless, so it is the only ethnicity that it doesn't include is the Russian. So there are ethnic Russians who identify as Ukrainian, and that is fine. Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting process to observe, definitely, but I don't. Right now, I'm not alarmed with the nationalism that we're seeing in Ukraine, because that is pretty much the only existential means of survival. And so we'll see what happens to it, 20, 30, 50 years into the future. Hopefully Ukraine perseveres and gets to really keep its statehood and its nationhood, but definitely it's playing a much more important role in the state building project. sometimes these things don't go hand in hand. Sometimes it's statehood, not necessarily nationhood. Right now we're seeing both. We'll see how it goes. I don't know if that answers your question, but I mean, I do understand why you might be alarmed.
Yeah, I think that it probably answers my questions. Yeah. Thank you, Olga.
Thank you. Is there any other question? Guya, you had more questions, right?
You go on, Tiago, and after we liberate all.
I mean, I have a very
so late for her now.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I'm always fascinated by computational methods, even though I can look at them and understand what's happening, but I'm not able to write the algorithm yet, and so on. Although I would pretty much like to be able to do it. But listening to you and looking to the graphs, to the figures that you have, what I was thinking is, because I'm always very interested in time and process. Could you, I don't know if you've done this analysis, but could you distinguish different phases in your figures in the network analysis that you've done and through the social media?
That's a great question, Tiago. That is something that I wish I was able to do. There are actually dynamic networks, and you can visualize dynamic networks in Giphy, which fascinates me. And so if I could, that's, I guess, my dream, to be able to see a dynamic semantic network and to be able to see this discourse unfold over time. There hasn't been an algorithm so far that does that. So unfortunately, these snapshots are inevitably reductionist. They're flattening. We're just flattening the discourse. And that's the limitation of those kinds of methods, is that you're just collecting the discourse. You're just like flattening it into a single kind of very flat frame of representation, and you map as a very static network. So it would be interesting sometimes. What would be interesting to do is this is just the data from 2014, so there's not a lot of dynamism. I also have this other project, which is part of a larger endeavor to observe the development of humanitarian networks between 2014 and 18. I actually have a book proposal with Stanford under review at the moment, where the goal is to create an interactive website that would allow users to really explore those networks in depth, rather than seeing those very flat snapshots where you can't distinguish all the labels and they're clunky and they're low resolution and all these things that just make it very difficult. It makes for a nice visualization, but no more than that. Whereas really qualitatively exploring those constructs and seeing what's happening would be beneficial. So yeah, so I take your point. It's reductionist, it's flat, it's kind of ahistorical. But then this depends on the research questions. So this evolution is incredibly interesting. I also saw really nice dynamic analysis in which it wasn't the network itself that was being visualized dynamically, but it was taking those snapshots each year, for example, and then you have some longitudinal metrics, right? You can map modularity, you can map centrality of different concepts, you can map different frequencies, and that gives you a time series to then do something with.
Or maybe I mean, I don't know if this is possible, but have to have clusters and then see how the cluster centrality or something like that evolves over time, no?
Yeah, you can map centrality across the years, and you can observe the longitudinal changes and then make inferences based on the centrality of certain terms. So that would be viable. And then you could do some quantitative analysis from there, right? You could just maybe run some regression or see the different factors that have influenced the centrality or the modularity. Unfortunately, again, in these topics, when I started working on this in 2018, when I first collected this data, it was a very kind of computer science approach. It was like, let's collect the data and see if there's communities. If there's no clusters, that's the end of the story. There's no story here. It's not worth pursuing further. So I guess this is, again, where we as researchers really have the agency to say, no, there's actually a lot of stories here, as long as you know what to look for. But then where do you mix and match the qualitative component? How legitimate is it? How rigorous is it considered to be? So I actually was able to defend this approach to system sciences at a conference once, and I was super proud of myself because there were a bunch of computer scientists in the room, and we talked about random walks and whatnot, which again, I don't have that amount of expertise to actually design those algorithms myself. These are off-the-shelf tools that I've applied. But yeah, this is something that I really aspire to work in. So hopefully if my project comes through, I'll get to actually try to see, there's really nice tools like stochastic block models where you can take a number of parameters. It's not just the topical network, it's also an interaction network, and really cluster those communities by different principle or by a number of parameters. So I mean, there's tools out there. It's just trying to see what applies to social media.
There's too many things these days to do this kind of work. No, best of luck with the project. No, this like the paper gave me, and your presentation gave me certainly a lot of ideas for the work that Guya and I are doing in terms of like how can we apply that to the data that we have and even collect more data, although we already have a lot of data. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions or comments?
Do I get to eat a tortilla? What's
Well, this would be nice. This for you is dinner time, Olga. What time is there?
It's almost 9 p.m.
Oh, okay. Well, very late. We let Olga free now, even if, of course, we would like to discuss with you much more. But we hopefully we will have more opportunities in the future. And for now, thank you very much for joining us, both you and Tanya, and well, all our support for your academic work also.
Thank you, Guya and Tiago and Lara, and thank you for being such an engaged audience. It's been a great pleasure to discuss this paper, and thanks for the opportunity. It really meant a lot, and it was really a great encouragement for us to push these ideas, and for me to work with Tanya on something that we both considered so important. So thank you so much for that.
Participating in it.
Thank you very much.
And well, have a nice evening and keep in touch. Let us know about the development of your project. We are interested in it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.